The Koran. It is one of the most influential books of all time. A sacred text that over 1 billion people live by.
It's a rule book about how to live one's life.
And yet, it holds untold mysteries.
It has the ability to provoke many meanings.
You have clearly texts in which God talks about peace and mercy, etc. But you also have texts that deal with violence and warfare.
From the Quran's mystical origins in the desert,
He heard this voice, and the voice said, recite.
to its dire warnings on justice and retribution.
The Quran is not shy about explaining the explicit punishments that people will suffer in hellfire.
What is at the heart of this holy scripture? What are the secrets of the Quran?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
Listen to some of the most powerful words in human history.
الحمد لله رب العالمين.
They are the engine driving one of the world's fastest growing religions.
مالك يوم الدين.
Echoed over 1400 years by billions of voices. They are the words of Islam's holy book, the Quran.
Muslims believe that the Quran is something that was revealed by God directly to the Prophet of Islam.
It's not merely what God inspired his prophet to say, or say a history of some important event. It is actually God's own message to the world.
In Arabic, Quran translates as the recitation. The scripture is meant to be spoken aloud. By doing so, Muslims believe they are communicating directly with God.
The Quran, in preserving God's speech, becomes essentially a part of God. And as such, the text itself, the physical words, the pages, and the book itself has this intrinsic sanctity, this intrinsic holiness to it.
Paging through the sacred text, one might first see similarities between the Quran and Jewish and Christian scriptures. Each speaks of one all-powerful God, and they all tell a number of the same stories. But many see the Quran as a book shrouded in mystery. Its verses, long considered some of the most beautiful Arabic ever written, are a labyrinth of language, more poetry than prose. And its layout defies easy understanding. Unlike the Bible, the Quran follows no chronology or narrative. Rather, its 114 chapters, or surahs, are organized mostly according to length, with the longest at the beginning and the shortest at the end.
There's this almost what we would describe in modern times as a kind of stream of consciousness style to it. There's a kind of mysteriousness. The curious reader in reading the text just is left wondering.
It doesn't tell, for example, the history of Muhammad. It doesn't even tell the history of the world. There is reference to the beginning of the world, to God's creation, but you won't find it in the beginning of the Quran. You'll find it somewhere in the middle.
Muslims don't see the Quran as a story. They see it as God's message to his creation, a rudder to steer believers on the right path.
It's a rule book about how to live one's life, about how to define one's morality, how to experience the world and the struggles and the conflicts that the world brings about.
Deciphering the Quran's meaning is no easy feat. There is no governing religious body in Islam, no Vatican to tell believers how to navigate the complicated text. Each person's understanding of the scripture is his own.
As a Muslim, you have to believe what the Quran says. Now, of course, the interpretation of what the Quran says could be different depending on who you listen to.
So what does the Quran really say? And what does it really mean? The binding words that Muslims live by today were revealed at a specific point in history to a given people in a given place. The traditional Muslim account of the Quran begins 1400 years ago on a barren stretch of the Arabian Peninsula. This remote land was home to Bedouin desert nomads and stable tribal settlements. It was an era that Muslims now refer to as Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance.
We might refer to Arabia as a backwater of civilization, compared to the great empires of Byzantium on the one side and the Sassanid Persian Empire on the other side.
In the middle of the desert, surrounded by mountains on all sides, was the town of Mecca, the social, economic, and religious center of Arabia. Mecca was the gathering place for many coexisting strands of religious thought. Some Arabians at the time had adopted the beliefs of Judaism and Christianity, and the stories and doctrines of those faiths were well known throughout the land.
Pre-Islamic Mecca was a city that was teeming with Jews and with Christians. So there was this stew of various Christian thoughts and various Jewish thoughts.
But the religious landscape of 6th century Arabia was dominated by people who believed in a host of gods. Every year, pilgrims flocked to Mecca to worship at the Kaaba, a shrine that had evolved into a pantheon for their myriad deities and idols.
They believed in the existence of God, but God was in a sense far too distant to be connected to the actual everyday activities of human beings. So these idols would be the intermediaries between them and God.
By the mid-6th century, 360 idols were kept in the Kaaba. The yearly pilgrimage to the shrine had huge economic benefits for the tribe that controlled the holy site, the Quraysh.
And all of these guys who are coming through, they have to make some offering. They have to pay some kind of a tax. So it's a very lucrative business.
The Quraysh had amassed a great concentration of wealth. While the leaders grew rich, most Meccans lived in abject poverty.
There was a major problem with regard to issues of economic maldistribution of wealth or economic injustice, issues with regard to the rights of orphans, of women, of the poor.
Slavery was normal practice in Mecca. Baby girls, considered worthless, were often buried at birth. This city of Mecca was the world into which a child named Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born in the year 570 AD, a poor boy who would grow up to become a prophet of one of the world's great religions. To Muslims, it is considered blasphemous to show any visual representation of Muhammad. Little is known of Muhammad's early life, and the accounts that do exist were written over 100 years after his death. Those stories say that by the time Muhammad was 6, both of his parents were dead.
As an orphan in this kind of society which was so highly stratified, he was part of the have-nots. He was part of the group that didn't belong to this landed aristocracy that controlled almost every aspect of the political and social and economic organization of the city.
But Muhammad had the support of a powerful uncle, and by the time he was 25, he had become a successful trader, the leader of a caravan with a reputation as a shrewd businessman. Muhammad was also known as a man of integrity, and he attracted the attention of a wealthy older widow named Hadija, who hired him to run her caravan operation. Soon after, she proposed marriage. According to the traditional Muslim biographies of Muhammad, he achieved financial success and built a happy marriage. However, he still struggled to find meaning in a world with so much poverty and injustice.
I think of the Prophet as being a religious seeker, somebody who was attuned to the notion of a God and of a developing spirituality really within his own life.
Muhammad found himself questioning the tribal religions that worshipped multiple gods.
He himself is believed by many to have been a member of a small group of peoples in Arabia who saw something wrong with the prevailing paganism, the rituals, the polytheism that was rampant in Arabia, and who would steal away from society from time to time in order to contemplate the realities of human existence.
It was during one of these retreats in a cave outside Mecca that Muhammad would have a vision that would change the course of history. In that cave, according to Muslim tradition, the Word of God would be revealed, setting off a chain of events that helped shape the world as we know it today. Five times a day, Muslims around the world turn in the direction of a beacon and pray. That beacon is the holy city of Mecca, located in what today is Saudi Arabia. But in the early 7th century AD, Mecca, Islam's most sacred site, was an Arab hub of pagan worship and a city rife with social injustice. That is, until the birth of one of the world's most sacred texts, the Koran. According to tradition, a 40-year-old trader named Muhammad ibn Abdullah would often withdraw alone to a cave outside Mecca to reflect on a world he saw as increasingly oppressive. It is believed that in the year 610, during one of his meditative retreats to the cave, Muhammad was abruptly gripped by an overwhelming presence.
Suddenly, he felt this intense pressure in his chest. He was surrounded by this darkness, and it felt as though he was being clasped by a giant hand and squeezed. He could barely breathe. And in his mind, he heard this voice, and the voice said, "Recite, recite."
He was shocked, stunned, probably wondering, did I really hear something? And then, as he heard it again, he finally said, I don't have anything to recite. And eventually that voice, which tradition tells us was the angel Gabriel, revealed the first verse of the Quran.
Chapter 96, verse 1. Recite, in the name of your Lord who created humanity from a clot of blood. Recite, for your Lord is the most generous one, who has taught by the pen, taught humanity that which it did not know.
This is a very important moment because it's the moment in which Muhammad ceases to be just an ordinary Meccan businessman concerned with society's ill and suddenly becomes what in the biblical tradition is referred to as prophet. And like most prophets, he wants nothing to do with it.
Panicked and worried about his sanity, Muhammad sought out his wife Khadija.
What he really wants to do is kill himself. But it is eventually Khadija who saves him from this, and who explains to him that he has been called by God, that he has been given a task of prophecy, and that he really has no choice but to make this message known.
The revelation in the cave marked the beginning of 22 years in which it said Muhammad received the divine messages that would become the Quran. According to tradition, sometimes the words came ringing in his ear like a bell. At other points, they came in torturous fits that resembled epileptic seizures.
He would go into these convulsions, he would sweat, he would suddenly look off into the distance, he would be almost dead to the observer. And when he came out of these prophetic moments, he would suddenly spew out these revelations.
These revelations always seem to reflect the needs of the Arab people. The early verses were terse and simple. They were a challenge to the pagan practices of the Meccans and a summons to worship a single God. Chapter 73, verse 8. Remember the name of your Lord, and devote yourself fully to him. He is the Lord of the East and the West. There is no God but he, so take him as your guardian. For the first few years of these revelations, Muhammad memorized the verses and only shared them with his wife and closest companions. But gradually he came to believe he'd been called to prophecy and that he had a duty to pass on to others the holy words collecting in his head. Finally, in the year 612, the reluctant prophet went into central Mecca and began to preach.
It was a wake-up call to those citizens of Mecca who, in the eyes of the prophet, had lost an awareness, if they ever had it, of a supreme God, of the one God who created all and who guides all.
But while the God of which Muhammad spoke was glorious and merciful, he was also wrathful. The prophet told the Meccans that a day of judgment would come when there would be consequences for their actions on earth.
Here is this man, it's known that he's been carrying on these vigils, and he comes into the marketplace, say, and he says, the world will end. The God who created the world will bring it to an end, and you are part of that. Now that is a powerful, powerful message.
A powerful message, but not a new one. Muhammad made it clear that the Koran was the very same revelation that had been sent down to the Jews and Christians centuries earlier, a message about God's guidance for humankind. But now the revelation was coming to the Arab people for the first time, and in their own language.
The Prophet never said that I brought a new religion for you. The Prophet simply said, I am a messenger bringing the same message which has been brought to you by dozens and dozens of these extraordinary figures in our mutual history.
Over and over again, the Quran says, do not forget what happened to Abraham when, and then it'll tell a story about Abraham. Do not forget what happened to Joseph, and then it will tell a story of Joseph. And the interesting thing about it is that these stories are presented in sort of a Reader's Digest version. They're sort of summaries of these great stories. The audience that the Quran was revealed to was already familiar with these stories because they were living in a city that was steeped in these traditions.
According to Muslims, one of the most remarkable aspects of the Quran is that Muhammad memorized the revelations as they came to him, and then recited them verbatim to his followers. While there was a form of written Arabic at the time, few knew how to read or write it. Muhammad was no exception.
The belief within Islam is that Muhammad was illiterate. What that underscores then, of course, is on the one hand, the fact that he wouldn't have written these revelations himself. On the other hand, the question is, well, how were they preserved?
Muhammad's small band of followers would promptly commit to memory each new revelation they heard, adding verse after verse to a mental collection of the already existing Quran. Given the culture that they were living in, such feats of memory are not surprising.
The societies that we are talking about are oral cultures. So in a sense, the oral culture in which Muhammad lived allowed people to listen in something for one time or even two times and have the ability to memorize that and be able to recite it verbatim.
As his catalog of revelations grew, Muhammad continued to preach on the streets of Mecca, gaining a small group of converts. His followers came to be known as Muslims, which means those who submit to God. Muhammad's message appealed especially to the city's poor and underprivileged, who heard their own lives echoed in the verse's pleas for social justice, that slaves should be freed, and that the rich and powerful should give charity to the needy. Some converts to the Quran's message were seduced by the beauty of the language itself, which they saw as so perfect, it must be evidence of God's existence.
When Muslims are asked, well, all right, what proof have you got that this is a divine revelation? Muslims will answer, and they have answered this over 1,000 years, the proof is the Quran itself. That is the miracle, that an illiterate man in the middle of nowhere suddenly produces this magnificent, powerful document.
But not everyone was enchanted with Muhammad's preaching. His provocative message, which refused to recognize the divinity of the idols kept in the Kaaba, infuriated the ruling Quraysh tribe and threatened its position of power.
And if you needed nothing to stand between you and this God, then there's no reason for the idols. And if there's no reason for the idols, then there's no reason for the Kaaba. And if there's no reason for the Kaaba, then there's no reason for Mecca's ascendancy as this social and economic capital of the Arabian Peninsula. So the conflict that the Quraysh had with Muhammad and these revelations was not a theological conflict. It was an economic conflict. It was a political conflict.
The Quraysh and the Meccan majority had little tolerance for the several dozen followers of Muhammad's message. The Muslims were brutally persecuted. Some were beaten in the streets, others tortured. For 9 years, the new Muslims endured the abuse, never wavering from their belief that there was, quote, no God but God. Muhammad himself was protected by his wealthy wife and powerful uncle. But when they died, the Prophet and his followers realized they had little choice but to flee Mecca.
The social fabric had been so shredded to the point that he did not feel that he would be able to physically continue in his mission in Mecca, and that he would have to begin to search for some kind of alternative base of operation.
With a new location would come a new kind of message in the Koran. An emphasis on law and a doctrine for war. For 12 years, beginning in 610 AD, Muslims believe the Prophet Muhammad received God's revelations and preached them in the Arabian city of Mecca. But life for Muhammad's growing group of followers became increasingly dangerous there. City leaders rejected the Muslim belief in only one God, viciously persecuted believers, and put a bounty on the Prophet's head. Then, in the year 622, Muhammad's luck would turn with an invitation from some out-of-towners.
A group of people from a neighboring oasis came to Mecca looking for someone to arbitrate a dispute they were having. Muhammad, as a prophet, was considered to be an ideal person for this job. And eventually they agreed to take in not only Muhammad and his family, but also a whole group of these Muslims.
Gradually, clandestinely, the small Muslim community made its way 250 miles north to Yathrib, a city which would from then on be called Medina, the city of the Prophet. With a new location came a new position for Muhammad.
Whereas at one point he was a prophet, merely the conduit of God's words flowing through him, in Medina he becomes a leader. His community of Muslims is part of that leadership, but also he is understood to have then an authority over the entire oasis of Medina.
In Medina, the Prophet continued to offer up revelations to his followers, but the nature of these messages was noticeably different. According to Muslims, the verses now reflected Muhammad's leadership status and added a new element to the message, a practical guide to creating and ruling a society.
The verses are basically about a society that needs regulation. And therefore, the most striking thing about the Medinan period is the laws, or practically all of the legislation that the Quran includes comes from the Medinan period.
The revelations traditionally associated with Medina laid the foundation for Islamic law. They included rules on nearly all aspects of life, from prohibiting alcohol to allowing mothers to nurse for up to 2 full years. The verses provided guidelines for inheritance, gave new rights to the dispossessed like orphans and slaves, and set new rules elevating the status of women in society. But the meaning of some of these laws was not always clear, and many are still debated to this day. A prime example: does the Quran allow polygamy? Chapter 4, verse 3. Marry those women who are lawful for you, up to 2, 3, or 4. But if you fear you cannot be equitable, then only one. At first glance, this verse seems straightforward, but scholars point out that such verses can be interpreted in different ways.
Some say this means you can have 4 wives. Some say it only means you can have one because you can never treat more than one person equally with another person. Some say that it refers only to a very specific situation when there were a lot of orphaned girls available, and the implication was, well, you got to take care of these orphans. So we have to realize that it's not always easy to read out of the text exactly what the implications are for our time, or for any time.
Inspired by the Quran's message and Muhammad's leadership, all of Medina converted to Islam. The laws handed down in the verses of the Quran became the laws of the city.
It was a community that was run by this revelation that was constantly coming forth from Muhammad's mouth. This was a living, breathing, constantly evolving revelation.
That revelation would soon give the Muslims permission to take up arms as a means of survival. The Meccans still had a bounty on the Prophet's head for preaching against their religious practices and threatening the fabric of their economy. And they were not about to tolerate Muhammad's new position as a head of state in Medina. In the year 622, the Meccans declared war on Muhammad and his followers. Just as it said the Quran had given them laws when the community needed order, now it gave them a directive to defend themselves against their attackers. Chapter 2, verse 190. And fight for the cause of God, those who fight you, but do not be aggressive. Surely God does not like the aggressors. Kill them wherever you find them, and drive them out from wherever they drove you out. Today, these verses, known as the sword verses, are some of the Quran's most striking and controversial passages. Those who argue that the Quran promotes violence turn to these verses to support their claims. But the lines tend to be more complex than simple battle cries.
The Quran says, slay the unbelievers wherever you find them. Well, this is within a context in which the Muslims are under siege, they have enemies, and the Quran is saying, you know, fight your enemies. You have a right to fight the enemies of God. The Quran also says, when the enemy ceases to be a threat, when it ceases to fight, then remember that God is merciful, remember that, you know, warfare is not the primary way that you should go.
Fueled by the revelations, the Muslims spent 8 years fighting the Meccans in battles all across the Arabian Peninsula. Then, in the year 630, the Muslims launched an attack, leading an army of 10,000 to the town of Mecca. The city surrendered. Tradition holds that, true to the Quran's instructions, Muhammad was merciful in victory, granting amnesty to everyone in the city. Once the Meccans were defeated, many converted to Islam and the teachings of the Quran. But Muhammad's mission wasn't yet complete. From the day he received the first revelation of the Quran in 610 to the day he fled to Medina 12 years later, Muhammad had publicly condemned the Meccans' pagan practices and the idols they worshipped in the Kaaba shrine. "There is no God but God," he repeatedly recited, quoting the Quran's most fundamental principle. Now Muhammad entered the Kaaba and destroyed all its deities, proclaiming it a sanctuary devoted to the worship of the one and only God.
Muhammad had achieved what he visualized as his goal, and that he had done what God wanted him to do.
In 632, just 2 years after returning to his birthplace, Muhammad died at the age of 62. With his last breath, the Quran was complete. But it did not yet exist in any physical form, only in the memories of the community. The messenger was dead. Now came the struggle by his followers to make the message live on. "14 centuries ago, Muslim tradition says the verses of the Quran were revealed to the Prophet Muhammad over a period of 22 years. His followers believed these were the literal words of God. The Prophet had preached about everything from religion to law to morality, and the newly born Muslim community tried to live by his every word. But following his death in 632, Muslims faced a difficult challenge: how to preserve the Quran, which was still an oral scripture.
During the Prophet's lifetime, the Quran itself was never written down. It was never even really considered a codified text. Remember that the Quran was revealed in stages, and it was always revealed according to whatever the needs of the expanding Muslim community was at the time. And the Quran just simply ceased with the Prophet's final breath.
But now, those who lived by the Quran recognized the need to set its words to paper and create an actual text.
People realized that this early generation that had memorized the entire Quran was dying off. And so therefore they were losing the direct connection to the Prophet's revelation.
What's more, Islam was beginning to spread beyond the Arabian Peninsula, and minor variations of the Quran's recitation were emerging. The Word of God was slowly being altered. According to tradition, a committee charged with compiling the Quran was appointed in 651 by Uthman, the third caliph, or political leader of the Muslim people. The committee was ordered to collect and authenticate the verses, some of which had been written down during the life of the Prophet, but remained scattered throughout the community.
We're told that the sources for this compilation were written texts on pieces of bone or fragments of parchment, but also from the hearts of men, from their own memories of the Quran's recitation.
The verses had to meet strict criteria. 2 eyewitnesses had to testify that each verse had been recorded in the presence of the Prophet, and all the verses had to be checked against the memories of the companions who had learned the entire Quran by heart. The approved text was amassed into a single volume, which was copied and sent to cities throughout the region. Uthman then ordered that all other written versions of the verses be destroyed. Muslims believe that Uthman's text, which was completed within 20 years after the Prophet's death, perfectly preserved God's revelations as preached by Muhammad, and that the Quran today remains unaltered from how it was revealed to the Prophet.
To Muslims, this is very important because it means that their scripture, which is the basic constitution of the ummah, of the community, is absolutely authentic.
It is that authenticity that Muslims claim distinguishes the Quran from the Christian and Jewish scriptures. Muhammad proclaimed that the message he received from God was the same message that was preached by Moses and Jesus. But according to Muslim tradition, when the revelations that became the basis of Judaism and Christianity were written down in the Old and New Testaments, parts of them were corrupted.
Muslims believe that the original revelation to Moses and Jesus came to be distorted over time, so that what we have in, if you will, the Old Testament and the New Testament is in fact both the original revelation and distortions, that is, changes that occurred because of historical, religious, and political conditions of the time.
Chapter 3, verse 78. There is among them a section who distort the book with their tongues, so that you would think it is part of the book, but it is no part of the book. And that say, that is from God, but it is not from God. It is they who tell a lie against God, and they know it.
The Quran claims to confirm, on the one hand, the scriptures that came before very emphatically, and on the other hand, it claims to correct certain aspects or certain ideas in the Hebrew and the Christian scriptures.
Muslims believe the Quran rectifies the mistakes in those scriptures, including some of the fundamental teachings of those faiths. For example, the Christian understanding of the figure of Christ. The Quran affirms that Jesus was a prophet, that he was born to a virgin, and that he performed miracles like curing blindness and leprosy. However, the Quran denies that Jesus was the Son of God.
Jesus as the Son of God is certainly understood within the Islamic context to mean that he is divine. And this would suggest from the Muslim point of view that Christians hold to different gods actually existing, whereas Muslims would hold that there can only be one God.
The Quran also disputes the Bible story of Jesus' crucifixion, saying that Jesus did not die on the cross, but God lifted him to heaven, and his would-be executioners mistakenly crucified another man who bore Jesus' likeness. Chapter 4, verse 157. They neither killed him nor crucified him, but it so appeared unto them. They did not kill him for certain. Rather, God raised him unto him. The Christian idea that Jesus died for the sins of humanity is a concept at odds with the Quran's message that all souls are responsible for their own actions.
The death and resurrection is an act of salvation. It doesn't work within Islam. You can't have this idea of somebody redeeming the sins of somebody else.
Muslims believe that it is because of distortions in the Bible that it was necessary for God to reveal his word one final time. In Islam, the Quran, as handed down to Muhammad and then preserved by Uthman, is believed to be the only true divine revelation.
The Quran is seen as the final, complete, uncorrupted revelation, and Muhammad is seen as the last or final prophet of God.
For 1400 years, Muslims have strived to follow that revelation. But interpreting the text is complex and controversial, and they believe getting it right is the only hope for salvation when the apocalypse, foretold in the Quran's pages, arrives. Chapter 81, verse 1. When the sun is folded up, and the stars lose their light, and when the mountains are made to vanish, and when the seas boil over, and the souls are sorted out, when the heaven is unveiled, and when the blazing fire is kindled to fierce heat, then shall each soul know what it has put forward. Such will be the scene, says the Quran, when God brings the world to an end. While the Quran may be a mysterious and complicated scripture to interpret, at least one of its messages is undeniably clear. In verse after verse, the Quran warns of an inevitable apocalypse, a day of reckoning when mountains will crumble and animal fetuses will fall from their mothers' wombs.
What the Quran is very emphatic and explicit about is that the world will end, and it will be a cataclysmic eruption of the natural order.
Like the biblical apocalypse described in the book of Revelation, the Quran repeatedly proclaims that humanity will be forced to atone for its actions on earth.
The Quran is not shy about explaining the explicit punishments that people will suffer in hellfire. The depictions of heaven and hell are some of the most striking passages in the Quran.
Like many of the scripture's verses, these depictions of the afterlife reflect the location where the Quran was revealed. The imagery of heaven and hell seemed geared specifically to an audience of desert dwellers. Heaven is portrayed as a lush and water-filled garden oasis.
Descriptions of hellfire likewise emphasize heat and burning, and things like cauldrons of molten copper that are poured down the throats of thirsty individuals as opposed to water. So, again, taking the pain and the suffering that's natural in that environment and bringing that up a level in order to describe what the suffering of hell is really all about.
To Muslims, the only sure way to achieve salvation on Judgment Day is to follow the Koran. But interpreting exactly what the Holy Book means has been an area of controversy for centuries, in part because Islam has no single religious authority.
There is no hierarchical structure in Islam. There is no such thing as a church. And therefore, people are pretty much at liberty what opinion to take.
Making matters more difficult is the seeming paradox. If God wants to reveal his message, why is the scripture sometimes so cryptic? Chapter 3, verse 7. It is he who has revealed to you the book with verses which are precise in meaning and others which are ambiguous. No one except God knows its interpretation. Most Muslims believe the only true interpreter of the Quran was Muhammad himself. As God's chosen messenger, it is said that he understood all the revelations, the verses that were concise and direct, as well as those that weren't so clear. As such, throughout the history of Islam, Muslims have looked to the accounts of Muhammad's life, his sayings, and his actions to help explain the Quran.
The Muslim community holds that everything which Muhammad said and did is a perfect manifestation of the will of God, and in fact that his life too is revelation in the same way that the Quran is revelation.
But studying Muhammad's life hasn't fully explained the eternal Word of God. For centuries, different Muslim sects and schools have fought over competing interpretations. Some have used their reading of the text to try to justify killing fellow Muslims who they believe have strayed from the faith. Others claim the Quran supports a militant stance against those of different religions.
The Quran is sort of quite an elastic document. You can find things in it to justify one side or the other. But often people do it when they're quoting from Lincoln or Washington or Jefferson. You can find things you're looking for, and it's the same with the Quran.
1400 years ago, the Quran was revealed to a small desert community. Today, it's the cornerstone for 1.3 billion believers worldwide. Since the first revelation in a cave outside Mecca, and throughout Islamic history, Muslims have strived to live the teachings of the Quran. What each person has found in the scripture's message is his or her own interpretation of the will of God.
The Quran needs to be understood in the context of what one great scholar of Islam said, it being an ocean. An ocean is a vast, mysterious creature.
For centuries, Muslims have discovered in that ocean the inspiration for love and fear, knowledge and law, anger and violence, mysticism and ritual. Their belief in the Quran has changed history. As with any religion, scripture can inflame passions, triggering the worst in those who claim to be living its message, or bring humanity ever closer to the divine. The Koran. For 1400 years, Muslims have sought to uncover the secrets concealed in its verses.
The Quran has several levels of meaning, and you discover them by constant reflection and by rendering the Quran into an open text.
Its words have inspired civilizations to greatness.
Islam spread within the first 100 years of its existence and created an empire greater than Rome had seen it.
Yet some have found in the Quran the basis for a violent ideology.
There are many religious figures who are very emotional, who are interpreting the Quran in a manner which suggests confrontation and violence and death.
What then are the true meanings of the Quran?
They say that little knowledge is very dangerous. Just to know how to read the Quran is not enough to understand what the Quran is saying.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم.
The Quran is the holy book of Islam. Over 1 billion Muslims worldwide believe it is the direct word of God as handed down to the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century. Unlike the Bible, the Quran does not have a traditional narrative structure. Instead, it is made up of 114 chapters organized mostly by length. Some are pages long, others just a few phrases. According to Muslims, God revealed the verses of the Quran to Muhammad over the course of 22 years. Scholars compiled them into written form only after the Prophet's death. Deciphering the Quran's meaning, therefore, has long presented a challenge.
It doesn't tell the story of Islam. It doesn't tell the story of the Prophet Muhammad or the early Muslim community. It really doesn't tell any stories at all. The Quran is essentially God's dramatic monologue.
For a minority of Muslims in the 21st century, that monologue has been used to justify an extremist political philosophy and a violent strain of religious fundamentalism. Chapter 58, verse 5. Those who resist God and His messenger will be crumbled to dust, as were those before them. This is how many, both Muslim and non-Muslim alike, have come to view the Quran. But while the Holy Book does contain passages that call for violence, this complex and mysterious scripture also has plenty to say against it. Chapter 5, verse 2. Cooperate with one another on furthering good and virtue, and do not cooperate on furthering sin and aggression. For the vast majority of those who live by the Quran, these messages of peace and compassion are its true guiding principles.
For many Muslims, the Quran is the source book for life. In other words, it's not just a book that tells the Muslim about his or her relationship to the divine creator, but it's also a source book of moral guidance.
How can two worldviews, one of peace and one of violence, coexist within the same book?
Those who want to present a picture of Islam as a violent religion will focus on those few verses that say the violent thing, and the ones who want to say that Islam is all sweetness and light and toleration will pick the other half. Neither is, of course, entirely true.
These contradictions are in many ways the product of more than 1,400 years of culture and conflict. According to Muslims, in the year 610 AD, in the town of Mecca on the Arabian Peninsula, Muhammad ibn Abdullah was called to prophecy by God. The revelations Muhammad received would come to be known as the Koran. Many of these revelations envisioned a more just and equal society and were revolutionary in scope. As Muhammad began to preach, these messages quickly captivated the hearts and minds of people who had suffered generations of inequity and oppression.
We have to care for the poor. We have to care for the needy. We have to care for the impoverished, those who are disenfranchised and powerless. That is really the main thrust of Islamic social justice.
What had been a mix of warring tribes, each with its own set of gods, was soon unified by Muhammad under Islam's banner. Within a few decades, the Quran's message expanded across the entire peninsula. After Muhammad's death in 632, Muslim rulers or caliphs continued to spread the word of the Holy Book. Chapter 18, verse 29. And report to the people the truth from your Lord. Let him who wills believe in it, and let him who wills reject it.
The Quran tells Muslims to spread Islam, to spread the message of Islam. And rulers, in particular, interpreted the spread of Islam in an imperial fashion.
Within 50 years, what had begun as a small community of faith centered in Mecca and Medina had thoroughly absorbed most of the Indian subcontinent. It had swallowed whole most of North Africa, and it had pushed the Christian empire deep into Europe and made it very little more than just a regional power.
The Quran would inspire a series of empires. One of the first was the Abbasid Empire, centered in Baghdad. Founded in the year 750 AD, the Abbasid Empire marked the beginning of the golden age of Islam, a civilization built on the messages contained in the Quran. A pillar of this civilization was a concept repeatedly emphasized throughout the Holy Book, that of ilm, or knowledge.
The word ilm or knowledge is used more often in the Quran than any other word except the word for God. God emphasizes knowledge because that is what makes us human beings.
It is ilm, say many scholars, that inspired the empire's rulers and helped their civilizations flourish.
The Quran is like the seed, and it exploded, it inspired these dormant human beings in Arabia to become inquisitive about everything and explore everything.
The Abbasid Empire achieved unprecedented heights in science, math, and technology. Its scholars collected many ancient Greek texts that may have otherwise been lost, and later passed them back to the Europeans.
This was an era in which the great works of literature, the great works of philosophy, in particular Aristotle, were preserved not in Greek, but in Arabic. These great works that essentially become the foundation of Western civilization were translated not from Greek to Latin, but from Arabic to Latin.
The Quran also served as inspiration in the arenas of art and culture.
In Islamic art, for example, we find that there's a tremendous emphasis on calligraphy, that is, on the writing in a beautiful way of the Arabic script, particularly when it's Quranic verses. You know, the Quranic verses as decoration become almost emblematic of Islamic art.
Like Christian monks who first copied down the Bible, the calligraphers chosen to transcribe the Quran were held in high esteem, and it sometimes took years to create a complete copy of the holy text. As the word of the Quran spread under the Abbasid Empire, millions of people came to live their lives according to its messages. One of those dictates centers around a word that appears just a few times in the Quran's pages and is one of the most controversial and misunderstood: jihad.
The basic use of the word jihad is a struggle to be a good Muslim, a struggle to live by the codes of Islam. That is the original meaning of jihad.
Jihad translates as struggle. It is marked by two distinct forms, the lesser jihad and the greater. Greater jihad, a phrase first used by Muhammad himself, refers to the internal struggle to improve one's soul and become a better human being in the eyes of God. Greater jihad is given more prominence in Islamic tradition. But lesser jihad has historically garnered more attention and controversy.
The lower form of jihad is a physical jihad. When you are attacked, your family is attacked, your wife is attacked, your children are attacked, you must stand up and fight back.
Chapter 22, verse 39. Permission to take up arms is hereby granted to those who are attacked. They have suffered injustice. God has all the power to give them victory.
A good Muslim, if Islam is under siege or the community is under siege, has the right, indeed may have the obligation, to defend his faith or her faith, the community, or oneself.
The concept of jihad as battle would soon be cast in a new light for those who lived by the Koran. At the high point of the Abbasid Empire, armies from Christian Europe would go on the march, and a series of battles for the holy city of Jerusalem would begin. The Crusades. In the 10th and 11th centuries, from Spain to India, two holy books served as the spiritual guides for millions of people, the Bible and the Koran. Led by the Koran, Muslim leaders ruled over several vast empires, huge cities of wealth and culture, centers of knowledge and art. Christian Europe, however, was languishing in what were known as the Dark Ages. Still, the two faiths and their texts had much in common. Islam views the followers of Christianity and Judaism as fellow people of the book who believe in the same God. Chapter 2, verse 62. Surely those who believe, and those who are Jews and Christian, whoever believes in God and the last day, and does good, they shall have their reward from God. The Quran also contains many references to biblical figures. Chapter 57, verse 27. Then we followed up these messengers with Jesus, son of Mary, to whom we gave the gospel, and we put in the hearts of his followers kindness and mercy. But in the Muslim world, European culture was not held in very high regard.
The Muslims had had a very clear idea of what the peoples of Northern Europe were like. They were of the wrong religion, they were boorish, they were unhygienic, they were like lumbering animals.
These two worlds were about to come into bloody conflict over one of the most sacred places on earth, Jerusalem, a city holy to Christians, Jews, and Muslims. After Mecca and Medina, the third most sacred city in Islam is Jerusalem. There, the Dome of the Rock marks the site where tradition holds Muhammad ascended to heaven. For centuries after the death of the Prophet in 632 AD, Jerusalem was ruled by Arab Muslims who had spread the message of the Quran throughout the region. Then, near the end of the 11th century, Turkish Muslims took control of the city.
The Turks are not Arabs. They're a separate ethnic group, but they're Muslims. Then they moved down south through Syria and in 1077 conquered Jerusalem from the Arabs.
The Turkish Empire was also expanding west and soon posed a direct threat to Christian Europe. The Byzantine Church, situated near the edge of the Turkish Empire, was the first to feel the pressure. In 1095, Byzantium made an urgent request for assistance from fellow Christians in Rome.
The Byzantine emperor sent a message to the Pope in Europe saying that he needed help to defend his frontiers against the incursions of the Turks who were coming ever closer to Constantinople, his capital.
Pope Urban II agreed to the military assistance and appealed to powerful knights throughout Europe to go and fight. To motivate them, Pope Urban framed the conflict as a battle between the faiths and their sacred texts.
Urbanus packages this together with an appeal not only just to push the Turks out of Asia Minor, but to continue on and push the Turks completely out of the regions that they had taken, including Syria, but most importantly, Jerusalem.
In 1096, the First Crusade was launched. More than 50,000 Christian peasants and some 7,000 knights set forth from Europe on a march toward the Holy Land. After a punishing 3-year journey, they reached the hills overlooking Jerusalem and laid siege to the city. The siege lasted a month, during which more than 1,000 crusaders died from both combat and disease. Then, on July 15th, 1099, the Christians broke through the walls that surrounded Jerusalem and poured into the city.
There was no love lost between these people. The Crusaders, who had now been for 3 years on the road to get to this place, and who had spent many weeks now outside of Jerusalem thinking they were about to die. And when they went in there, it was a pretty brutal sack of the city.
There is no doubt on both sides of the historiography for this event that the Crusaders were exceptionally bloodthirsty. The memory of the brutality of the Crusaders is still with Muslims today.
In the aftermath of what was a devastating defeat, many looked to the Koran for answers.
Immediately after the coming of the First Crusade, religious scholars were assembling and saying to themselves, reading the holy text, "What have we done wrong? Why have we incurred God's displeasure?"
In the Quran, one concept proved to be key as Muslims tried to understand how they had lost one of their holiest cities and how they might be able to win it back. They turned to jihad, or struggle, and laid the groundwork for their own holy war.
Islam at that point did not have any equivalent of the holy war. This is how the very word jihad changed its meaning as a result of the Crusades.
But Muslims would not launch their holy war until nearly a century later, with the rise of two warriors who would use jihad as their rallying cry. Nur ad-Din was a powerful leader who, in 1146, took control of parts of what are now Syria and Jordan. A deeply religious man, he immersed himself in the study of the Quran.
Everywhere he went, he took with him religious scholars, Quran readers, mystics, inspiring the troops, reading out relevant verses of the Quran to do with jihad.
Chapter 9, verse 14. Fight them. God will chastise them at your hands, and he will lay them low and give you victory over them. For Nur ad-Din, these passages were taken as a call to arms to win back Jerusalem. Nur ad-Din's interpretation of jihad resonated with his subjects who were eager to defeat the Europeans. When a second Crusader army, launched from Europe in 1145, reached the lands controlled by Nur ad-Din, it was roundly defeated. Nur ad-Din's victories were an inspiration to those around him, including his deputy, a young warrior who was also a devout student of the Quran, his name Saladin.
He worked really for the spiritual rebirth of the region. And so he was a very religious man. One of his friends said that he thought of God and also the jihad all the time. And if you weren't talking to him about that, he didn't want to talk to you.
In 1174, as momentum was building towards an all-out assault to recapture Jerusalem, Nur ad-Din died. The reins of power were taken over by Saladin, who began making plans for his attack on the Holy City. But first, Saladin would have to face the Crusaders in a bloody and decisive battle outside Jerusalem. On a dry mountain plateau, under a parching desert sun, Saladin and his troops would be comforted by verses from the Koran as they prepared to meet the enemy. July 4th, 1187. Sunrise on the Hattin Plateau, a barren expanse of desert 70 miles from the city of Jerusalem. Muslim soldiers were preparing to attack an encampment of Christian crusaders. To inspire his men, the commander, Saladin, ordered a religious advisor to read passages from the Koran. Chapter 3, verse 195. As for those who forsake the domain of evil and are driven from their homeland and fight for it and are slain, I shall most certainly efface their bad deeds and bring them into gardens where running waters flow as a reward from God. At this point in history, for the first time, handheld Korans allowed Muslims to keep the word of God with them at all times. Because the Koran began as an oral scripture, each village had its own hafiz, or one who memorized the holy book. In time, these villages began transcribing Korans for individual use.
The small pocket Korans that came in the 11th century were on paper, and they made the holy text accessible to ordinary people. They could put it in their pocket, close to their flesh, so to speak, to feel that it was acting as a kind of protection from God.
The night before the assault, the Muslims set the grass around the Crusader camp aflame. By dawn, the Crusaders were enveloped in choking smoke. As the sun began to rise over the battlefield, the Muslims attacked. After half a day of fierce battle, the Crusader army lay devastated. Emboldened by his victory, Saladin turned his eye to reclaiming Jerusalem. Within 3 months, Saladin's army had advanced to the gates of the Holy City and surrounded it. After a 12-day siege, the vastly outnumbered Christian forces surrendered. Saladin now faced a choice: what to do with the thousands of captives under his command.
He was persuaded by his advisors that here was an opportunity to show mercy, to show the superiority of Islam as a religion over Christianity.
Saladin decided to accept the surrender of the Christian commander. He then released all the prisoners unharmed.
He allows those who can ransom themselves to go, and then when those people who cannot afford to pay ransom, he allows them to go and pays for them by his own estate. Now, this kind of action is only possible if you're inspired by the Quran, as is Salahuddin.
The loss of Jerusalem was a bitter defeat for the Christians in Europe, and the fall of the city quickly triggered another crusade to win it back. This third crusade, launched in 1189, was led by Richard the Lionhearted, the King of England. Like Saladin, Richard was known for his devotion to his faith and his bravery in battle. The two warriors were worthy opponents.
Richard would have heard about Saladin and his reputation even before he set out from his home in Europe to the Holy Land. Saladin had been much praised and feared.
Richard's early battles with Saladin's forces led to decisive Christian victories. But taking Jerusalem would prove far more difficult. Saladin's armies were strong, and the open land around the walled city made it difficult to mount an attack. The Muslims and Christians were at a stalemate. On September 2nd, 1192, both sides agreed to a truce.
The Third Crusade is a bit of an anticlimax from the Muslim point of view. Saladin failed to remove the Crusaders permanently from Muslim soil.
Both Christians and Muslims had fought hard in the name of their holy books. Yet because neither side had won a decisive victory, the battles they had waged for more than 100 years would remain unresolved. And centuries later, those wounds would be reopened by the approaching clash between Islam and modernity. When it came, two Muslim scholars would help lay the groundwork for a new age of Islam, one that would advocate a new view of the Koran and what it says about jihad. According to Muslim belief, in the 7th century AD, the verses of the Quran were revealed by God to the Prophet Muhammad. These revelations spawned a new religion and launched a succession of powerful empires.
The Quran was sort of the engine. It's just a phenomenal unleashing of intellectual and religious energies that really informs the culture and the society at the time.
What became known as the Golden Age of Islam lasted hundreds of years, but by the 15th century, the decline had begun. Internally, the resources of the various Muslim empires were stretched thin, and they began competing with each other for land and influence. According to some scholars, this infighting was due in part to society turning away from the Quran's injunctions to seek knowledge, or ilm, and focusing instead on the raw pursuit of power.
The downfall begins in the 15th, 16th centuries when ilm or knowledge is no longer prized. So you have Muslim empires fighting other Muslim empires, and there's tyranny and there's oppression, and the scholar is being more and more marginalized.
Of equal importance to the decline of the empires were external forces, in particular, the growing power of Christian Europe. The last of the great Muslim empires was that of the Ottomans. Centered in Turkey, the Ottoman Empire began its rise in the 15th century and eventually spread as far as the gates of Vienna. It was here, in 1683, that European forces decisively halted Muslim expansion. For 2 months, more than 200,000 soldiers battled outside the city walls. In the end, the Ottoman army was defeated. From this point on, Muslim influence lost more and more ground to the powers of Europe. With a central political authority no longer in place, variant interpretations of Islam spread throughout the Muslim world. In response, a movement would arise that sought to restore Islam to its former glory and to a literal reading of the Quran. In the mid-18th century, a scholar named Muhammad ibn Abdel Wahhab lived in the declining Ottoman Empire in what is today Saudi Arabia. He came to believe that Muslims had strayed from the teachings of the Quran, and he advocated a return to what he claimed were the fundamentals of his religion.
He saw his society as becoming corrupt, so like, quote, any good revivalist, the notion is, if we're corrupt, it means we've departed from true religion, we need to get back to true religion. And for Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, that meant going right back to the Quran and to the example of the Prophet.
Wahhab believed that all non-orthodox interpretations of the Quran should be banned. He called for such things as the stoning of adulterers and the amputation of the hands of thieves, rules spelled out in the Holy Book, though not always applied.
The Quranic literalists don't see that this was something that was written in the early medieval period or the late ancient period. It's one thing to have it written in the Quran and another thing to implement it.
Wahhab's strict interpretation of the Quran might have remained his own, but for a fateful meeting. In 1744, while traveling across the Arabian Peninsula, Wahhab met a local leader named Muhammad ibn Saud. Saud was an ambitious chieftain bent on unifying all of Arabia. Armed with Wahhab's fundamentalist teachings, Saud believed he could use both a sword of steel and a sword of faith to subdue the peninsula.
They actually literally signed a compact. You will be the religious leader and I will be the political leader, and we will try and take the whole peninsula.
It would take nearly 2 centuries, but in 1924, descendants of Saud finally conquered Arabia. They now controlled Islam's holiest cities, Mecca and Medina. 8 years later, the modern state of Saudi Arabia was established, and the stringent doctrines of Wahhabism became the law of the kingdom. But it was not Wahhab who would create a fundamentalist doctrine for the modern age. That task was taken up by an Egyptian journalist who built on Wahhab's philosophy to create his own interpretation of the Quran, one grounded in violence and steeped in controversy. His name, Sayyid Qutb. 1918, the end of World War I spelled the final collapse of the faltering Ottoman Empire. Across the Middle East, Arab lands were divided up between European colonial powers, which established secular and often oppressive regimes. This was the world in which Sayyid Qutb, born in Egypt in 1906, grew up. As a young man, Qutb was neither radical nor religious. A journalist and a scholar, his work took him to America in 1948. There, he was shocked by what he saw as a decadent society, and his radicalization began.
When he came to the United States, he was largely secular. So I guess one has to believe him that what freaked him out about the United States were 2 things. One was the segregation and the racist laws which were still in force. The second thing was women. He was totally taken aback by the freedom with which women transported themselves. This came as a big shock to him.
When Qutb returned to Egypt, he joined the Muslim Brotherhood, a political organization that opposed British colonialism and advocated a return to the time when the Quran was the law of the land. Qutb's transformation accelerated when, in 1954, Egyptian President Nasser began a crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood. Qutb was arrested and put in jail.
It was really in the dank and sadistic prisons of Nasser's Egypt that Qutb, who was repeatedly tortured, who saw so many of his fellow Muslim brothers tortured and murdered, that this radical reinterpretation of the Quran took hold of him, where he no longer believed that preaching and living a good moral Muslim life was enough to change Muslim and Arab society, that it required a revolution.
His interpretation of Islam became an interpretation of Islam under siege and of Muslims under siege.
In prison, Qutb wrote two of his most important works, a commentary on the Koran and an incendiary political manifesto titled Milestones. Like Wahhab, he argued that the Quran alone was the source of knowledge and the guide to daily life. Qutb believed that only by returning to the, quote, true faith could Islam be saved. Qutb also found in the Quran the justification for armed struggle against those who stood in the way.
What Sayyid Qutb did is to go to the scriptures and, in effect, say, look at the scriptures, look at those sectors of the scriptures that talk about what do you do when you're under siege, what do you do when it's a war between belief and unbelief, and he used those texts to legitimate what he was doing.
His argument is that the world has changed and that the Muslim governments are no longer properly defending the world of Islam against incursions from outside. And so, he argues, each individual Muslim must now take the responsibility of military jihad on their own shoulders.
Throughout the 1960s, Qutb's writings struck a chord with many Muslims in the Middle East who had suffered for years under colonial rule. Qutb reinforced a growing sentiment that colonial rule was the equivalent of a new crusade.
That ideology proved to be an inspiration. And so Qutb is both an inspiration to mainstream, if you will, Muslims and Islamic activists, as well as to a whole variety of extremists that developed. This runs right down to people like Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda.
The legacy handed down by Wahhab and Qutb to Muslim extremists in the decades to follow would cause many, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, to take a closer look at the Quran, triggering a debate about the true meaning of its mysterious verses. For more than 14 centuries, the Quran has been a source of guidance for Muslims around the world. But what believers find in its pages has often depended on what they are looking for. Like nearly all holy books, the Quran contains a host of meanings that are sometimes contradictory and difficult to reconcile. There are numerous verses that call on believers to live peacefully and to create a society built on justice and understanding. Chapter 16, verse 90. Behold, God enjoins justice and the doing of good and generosity toward one's fellow men, and he forbids all that is shameful and all that runs counter to reason. But other verses in the Quran command Muslims to rise up in arms against non-believers. Chapter 9, verse 29. Fight those who believe not in God, nor acknowledge the religion of truth, until they pay with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. In recent years, a relatively small but growing percentage of Muslims have found in verses such as these the justification for a violent ideology.
There is, in a very real way, a struggle for the soul of Islam between a majority and a minority. A minority that is a minority, but that is dangerous and have an impact beyond its numbers.
In 1998, Osama bin Laden quoted one of these verses. Fight and slay the pagans wherever you find them, seize them and take them captive, and lie in wait for them in every stratagem of war.
Osama bin Laden quoted from the Quran and also the example of the Prophet in order to try to justify his actions and the actions of these other radical leaders in pursuing their form of jihad.
But Muslim and non-Muslim scholars alike point out that bin Laden's use of the Quran is selective and distorted.
What's interesting is that when we go back and look at the verses of the Quran that bin Laden quotes, he plays with them in a way to make them seem more military than in fact they are. He quotes one verse that talks about the need to fight and kill the unbelievers. And that's where he stops. But the verse continues.
It also says, but when the enemy ceases to be a threat, when it ceases to fight, then remember that God is merciful. Remember that, warfare is not the primary way that you should go.
Scholars argue that this type of distortion is common among radical Muslims who insist there was once a time when followers of the Koran accepted a single interpretation of its words and lived by that interpretation.
This conception that there was this one version of Islam that we can go back to before it was fractured and separated into these competing versions of Islam is simply untrue. It never existed. From the very first moment in which the Prophet Muhammad revealed the very first words of the Quran, it was absorbed and understood and interpreted in wildly different ways by a whole host of different people within the community.
Whether the Quran should be used to condone acts of terror goes to the heart of the crisis within Islam today. The roots of that crisis can be found in the struggle that nearly all other great religions have faced: how to maintain the status of their sacred text in a modern world that seems to deny its relevance.
Islam and Muslims are going through a period analogous to what other faiths have gone through, Judaism and Christianity. And Muslims have been struggling with this since the late 19th century, the relationship of tradition to modernity or post-modernity. What's the relationship of a religious tradition to today?
Fundamentalism is a reaction to modernism. It's a reaction to change. Change is inevitable, and as long as change is inevitable, fundamentalism will be inevitable.
It's also inevitable that believers look to the Quran for answers about the future.
The Quran has been used to divine the future, but it does not itself pretend to hold the secrets of the future. Ultimately, the future that the Quran is concerned about is the end of time.
Still, that has not prevented some from claiming to find in its pages specific forecasts. One Muslim man, pointing to Quranic verses that refer to a great deluge, predicts that a powerful tsunami will strike the United States in 2007 as punishment for crimes against humanity. But most scholars discount these kinds of prophecies as yet another distorted reading of the text.
So there's all kinds of different ways of interpreting it, interpreting what the meaning is of the text. Really, the difficulty is not what the text says, but what do we want to make it mean?
For centuries, through times of war and peace, the Quran has helped shape human history. The messages in Islam's holy book have been used to launch some of the world's greatest civilizations, and they have been cited as inspiration for acts of barbarism.
Muslims respect the Quran, they're motivated by the Quran. The challenge for Muslims is go to the Muslims and confront them like a mirror, hold that mirror up to them and say, where is this coming from? Is this coming from the Quran, or are the messages of peace, of compassion, of friendship, of knowledge stronger in the Quran? And if we can get it right, then we will be able to change the very nature of Muslim society in the 21st century.
Because of widespread literacy, because of widespread access to the Quran, Muslim individuals, and particularly Muslim women, are going to the Quran by themselves, for themselves, many for the first time. They are creating an Islam that is becoming ever more diverse, that is becoming the exact opposite of what these jihadists and these extremists want it to be.
How the Quran will continue to influence the events of history depends on how the millions of believers around the world interpret its words and how they choose to live by their holy book.